Hello and welcome to Signs and Wonders. Today I'm going to talk about a wonderful character, King Solomon. Now, King Solomon, whose name means peace, he has another name, Yedida, I think, which means friend of God. Now, King Solomon is well known to the whole world as a wise king, and he appears in biblical stories, but he's also one of the prophets in the Quran. So most people brought up with Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, will know all about King Solomon. And even though I didn't have a Bible kind of family when I was little, obviously I went to a school where there was a certain amount of religious education, and I must have been quite small when I heard about King Solomon and his wise actions, and the way that he would invite people to come to him for a judgment. He would sit on a very special throne of judgment, and people would bring their problems to him. And perhaps you know the most famous one, which was when two women came to him with one baby and said that they were squabbling over who was the mother for this baby. And King Solomon said, "Oh, well, I can sort that one out. Bring me a sword and we'll chop the baby in half and you can each have a half." And naturally, the real mother said, no, don't do that. Let the other lady have the baby. And then King Solomon knew that the woman who was willing to surrender her baby rather than see it die was the right mother. So that's the famous story, and you may already have known that. But there's this whole thing about wisdom. Well, there's a lot of stuff in the King Solomon story that is very special and pertinent to us when we think about kingship, about wealth, and about wisdom and what wisdom might be. So let's unpick some of the things. I mean, King Solomon, according to the biblical story, was quite a lad. He had 1,000 women. I think it was 300 concubines and 700 wives, or the other way around. I think it must have been 300 wives, and then the rest were concubines. And he also, although he built the first temple for Yahweh, some of his wives were foreign, and he would put up little temples for their deities as well, which didn't go down very well, certainly with the later writers who told his story. So, of course, that's one of the things about history of any kind, that it can always be tampered with by the opinions of people who come afterwards. So there was King Solomon, quite a lad with his thousands of women, and of course his father had been quite a lad. His father had lusted after Bathsheba, who was married to somebody else. And he had an adulterous affair with Bathsheba, and then he arranged for her husband to go into battle because then he would die and David could have Bathsheba to himself. So to punish him, God allowed David's first son to die because it was a child of an adulterous relationship. But when he has a second child by Bathsheba, who he has married by that point because she has indeed been widowed, then this child is called Solomon. And the biblical story tells us he was loved by God. So he was a friend to God, and there was some kind of special thing about this child. Now, at a certain point in the story, Solomon has some consultation with God, and he's allowed to ask for what he wants. It's just like God is being the great grandfather, the great loving godfather, and will give Solomon anything he wants. And Solomon says the only thing he wants is wisdom. Now, because that's what he asks for, and he doesn't ask for anything material. Then he gets all the other stuff as well. So he gets the material wealth, and he is enormously wealthy. And you can see from the picture that I put up as the opening picture for this video that this is one of the things that he's famed for, having this enormous wealth and building this enormous temple. And the temple is laden with gold and jewels and wood that has come from a very special forest, the cedar forest of Lebanon. And he's had all the best craftsmen make the most beautiful things for this amazing temple. And he has nonetheless also got power over the natural world and the celestial world as well, the angels and so forth. And the power over the natural world means that he's got command over the jinn, or the genie, who were the spirits of the earth, and they were magical beings. And in some legends about Solomon, it is these jinn who actually build the temple for him. Now, the other thing about this temple that many modern authors who are interested in sacred geometry have written about is the fact that in the biblical story we get immense detail about the measurements of this building, and it seems as though it's created on the basis of sacred geometry. So there's something creeping in here about magic. So King Solomon has got power over the jinn to get them to build his temple for him, and somehow he's also got these magical measurements, and the building is going to be created according to that plan, that mathematical and geometrical plan. One of the problems with the story about King Solomon, by the way, is that nobody's ever found anything archaeologically that measures up to this old biblical story. And some scholars even think that, he might not have really been a king at all. I mean, it might all be mythologized history. But that's beside the point in some ways. We have a legend about this character. And another part of the legend, of course, is the famous meeting with the Queen of Sheba. And there's a story goes that although King Solomon has power over all the birds and the beasts of the air, he discovers that there's one particular bird, I've forgotten what it's called now actually, I ought to know, but one particular bird that's not summoning, he can't summon it, it's not coming when he calls. And eventually he sends out messengers to find out, well, where's this bird gone? They're all supposed to come when I call. So when the bird eventually turns up, the bird says, oh, well, I was off looking for something special for you, and what I found was this Queen of Sheba. And this bird says the Queen of Sheba is also very wealthy. She's got lots of jewels. She's very beautiful. And the king sends an invitation using the bird, sends the Queen of Sheba an invitation, and she comes to visit Solomon. That's one of the stories. Another story is that the Queen of Sheba herself heard about Solomon and his huge wealth, and she decided to visit him to see whether this was true. So they have this splendid meeting, apparently, and according to the Ethiopian history, they have a child called Menelik. And Menelik becomes the very first king of Ethiopia. And although he was originally Jewish, those kings later in history became Christian, and there was an uninterrupted monarchy, a kingship, from Menelik right the way through to Haile Selassie, who was deposed in the 1970s. So they trace their history right the way back to King Solomon. And then there's another magical bit to this story, because one of the things we're told in the biblical tale is that part of the purpose of building this amazing structure was to create a house for the famous Ark of the Covenant. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is such an amazing wonder, I think it needs a video of its own. But what we can say here, just to make the story a little bit shorter for today's video, is that the Ark of the Covenant was lodged in the temple. At some point in history, that Ark of the Covenant goes missing. And the Ethiopians, the modern Ethiopian church, claims that they have got it in their possession in a place called Axum, and that there is a priest who's appointed to watch over it, and nobody else ever gets near it. They have a copy of it that they take out into the streets for celebrations, but the actual real Ark of the Covenant, according to the Ethiopians, is still in this church, guarded by a priest. So there's the story. And connected and laced in with this story are the archetypes, if you like, of enormously powerful sovereignty, kingship, leadership, enormous wealth, and enormous magic. And King Solomon's name is associated much later in the Middle Ages, for example, with magic. And he was supposed to have a ring with King Solomon's seal on it, which is like a pentagram. So he's associated with magic. There are lots of medieval books about King Solomon's magic. So all in all, this character, whether he was a real historical person or not, is associated with this figure who can do all these things. And the reason he can do it is because he is loved by God. He is a friend of God. That's his other name. And this connects with a lot of stuff that you get in the old biblical stories that do bring a sense of wonder. Certainly did to me when I first came across them, quite late in my life, really, because I didn't have them as a kid. What does that mean? What does that mean when God says this or that to this person? And it seems so outrageous in some ways compared with the way we see reality in our present time. Is there any underlying metaphysical possibility here that somebody can actually harness this kind of magical energy represented by these jinn, these magical beings? What is going on? This was clearly something that was totally accepted and recognised in the ancient Middle East. And that's where we get all these stories like, open sesame, the magic words, or the magic ring, or the magic lamp. They're all coming from the same tradition, which suggests that some human beings may have what we call paranormal powers. And what is it that gives them those powers? If you go to the yogic tradition, what they would say is that you get those magic powers when you're in a certain state of consciousness, when you elevate your consciousness to a new level. And perhaps that's what it means by being a friend of God and God loving you. It's like there's a surrender and an engagement with the power of creation, which I don't call it God, I call this the divine source of all energy. And when we participate in that in a co-creative way, we have access to immense possibilities, most of which, most of the time, we cannot conscientiously make use of. And this is, to go back to the yogic tradition, this is why the yogis practice what they call the siddhis. They practice meditation techniques that put their consciousness into a certain state, and then they learn to levitate and so forth. So it is quite possible that there is this intermingling of these ancient wisdom traditions that come out of that come from India, that we see in the Indian tradition, but we also pick up in the Jewish tradition, especially when the Jewish tradition gives rise to what we call Kabbalah. So King Solomon, his keywords, if you like, would be sovereignty, wealth, knowledge, knowing how to do something, as well as wisdom. And in fact, the word wisdom has got the same etymological root as wizard. So a wise king is not just some kind of sensible, kind of commonsensical, wise person in the way that we would use that word nowadays. For them, a wise king was somebody who knew how the magic works and could command the jinn. So he had the knowledge. And in that sense, he's rather like the Hierophant. Solomon is like the Hierophant in the tarot pack. Let me show you my favourite image of the Hierophant. This is the one that in a tarot pack that I use called the Alchemical Tarot. And here we have the, let me straighten him up a little bit. Here we have a Hierophant who's sitting, he's wearing a red robe. He's often described in some very old tarot packs as the Pope. But he is a Solomon kind of figure because he has the magic book in his hand. And he has this triple crown, which again is associated with the papacy. But I'm interested by the triple crown in the sense that it seems to me to indicate the four worlds. So the top crown is connected to heaven and it gives access to the inspiration. And the second crown is the understanding of the archetypes and how things are organised as a subtle level. And the third crown is to do with wisdom and the patience and the ability to nurture the project that's got to be created. And then the fourth, of course, will be his own physical body. So the four worlds are represented in the image of the Hierophant wearing the triple crown. And of course, in this particular version, that we have the sun and the moon. So he understands the cosmology of the universe as well, which is also part and parcel of being a wise man, being a magus. And of course that eventually ties in with the notion of the magi who come to see Jesus when he's born, because they come from that same kind of magical tradition that you get in the Middle East. King Solomon was about 900 years before that, but it's a very ancient tradition that certain people trained their consciousness to know things. And one of the things that they used was divination by the stars. They knew when something spectacular was about to happen, which is why they come to Bethlehem. So there you have King Solomon, and I think even though it's really old, dusty history in many ways, it's a very, very powerful legend which tells us something about what human beings claim at certain points in history. They claim that they can make these magical things happen. And this history of this goes back a long, long way. And it's only in our modern techno-scientific materialist world that that kind of notion has been dismissed and swept under the carpet. So meditating, using your own consciousness to change your personal reality, that's not such a tall order, really. So goodbye for now, and keep meditating and keep shining. And I'll come back shortly with another episode.